So a warm welcome to everybody for joining our ADHD Richmond and Kingston meeting this evening. My name is Annette Wilson and I'm the chair of ADHD Richmond and Kingston. I know I've met a lot of you and a number of you would have joined our seminars in the past. This evening we've got a highly topical talk really about how parents can support their children going back to school. And I think this year it is particularly a difficult period just because it's such a different scenario. The kids haven't been in school for months and you've all dealt with homeschooling. And I know it's always tough to start a new school year anyway, but I think this year in particular. So with that, I really also delighted to introduce you to our speaker. But actually, before I do that, let me just deal with some housekeeping. You should all be on mute. And if you're not, I will put you on mute because we just find that this seminar is being done from home or people tuning in from home. Often you've got kids walking around or, trying to settle down for the evening, and we just don't want to have any noises in the background. But what we will do is we will allow time for questions at the end. But if you've got questions as we go along, do feel free to type in your questions at the bottom of the chat bar. If you look right at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the fifth button from the bottom, the fifth button from the left-hand side at the bottom of your screen is a chat bar, and you can just type in any questions you've got. And then at the end of Emma's talk, we will actually have a chance to go through them. And we'll certainly try and cover as many of the questions as possible. I should also mention that we are recording the evening, and so we would, what we do after the event, we basically will post it on our website. So if you want to cross-refer to it, you're welcome to watch it again, and people find it really helpful. So I think that is probably all the housekeeping. So with that, I have great delight in introducing Emma Weaver, who's our speaker this evening. Emma is the Director for Early Learning at the ADHD Foundation, and she works very closely with families and with children with ADHD. And I also know she's really passionate about helping people, and particularly for empowering parents and the children to deal with some of the challenges that they come across. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor to Emma. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks for the introduction, Annette. I'm now going to share my screen with you so that you can see the presentation for tonight. Really looking forward to talking to you all tonight. Thank you for joining us. I'm aware it's 8:15. Annette and I, before you guys joined, were discussing how dark it's gone, how suddenly the summer seems to have ended and we've got autumn on the way. I've had to switch my light on so that you can see me. But what we're going to be talking about in tonight's session is we're going to be thinking about returning to school and how we support our children with ADHD moving back into school, thinking about that transition. In particular, thinking about how our kids are going to cope with the change. There's been so much that we've been through over the last few months and so much more over the coming months that I think we need to kind of really think about and really plan for when it comes to supporting our children with ADHD in particular. So when I was thinking about this presentation in particular, I was thinking about change and what happens when we experience change. And then as I was kind of thinking through that concept, I was then thinking about how back in March, what happened was a forced change. So we were kind of forced into something that was very much out of our control. Those restrictions were put on us. What we found was that schools closed very, very quickly. We were all brought indoors. For our children with ADHD in particular, and I work therapeutically in schools, so I work alongside lots and lots of families and young people. And my job during lockdown was to keep in touch with quite a lot of the children that I support therapeutically. And what I found was there was just a range of different emotions that the children were experiencing. I'm not going to lie, there was quite a few children that were thriving actually in homeschooling. I think what we were finding was that the reduction in kind of the stress that's around school for some of our children, because that had been reduced or taken away, they were thriving at the opportunity for being at home. I also met with some children who were really, really struggling with it and expressed a range of extreme emotions as well. So what I was thinking was how change represents different things for different people. So over the last 6 months, I know children, and you will know yourselves, that depending on how they have managed change in the past will have impacted how they've coped over the last few months. How their capacity, their resilience levels, how much tolerance they have for change as well will have a massive impact of how they've coped with things. And I suppose what we need to think about is, now September's here, we've got to change again. So we're changing into going back into education, but education is going to look very, very different to what it looked like back in March. So what we might find is that some of those expressions of emotion that we saw at the beginning of lockdown back in March, we might see a resurface of some of those emotions again. And I suppose what's really important is when we think about planning support for our children over the next few weeks, we need to think about those resurfacing of emotions that we possibly will see. We also know that when we are more stressed or anxious about things, we tend to have a heightened sense of our emotions. So we might find that our children demonstrate more kind of significant reactions to things. So we might see a higher sense of anxiety. We might see changes in behaviour as well because of that. I think if we can plan for it and we're prepared for it, then we're equipped to be able to support them much better. Now, I just wanted to touch on this as well. You know, we're all going through change at the moment, those with neurodevelopmental conditions, but also those who don't have neurodevelopmental conditions are experiencing change in lots of different ways. But what we've got to hold in mind is that our children with ADHD have a developmental delay. From an emotional maturation perspective, so from their emotional maturity, they are behind everybody else in their year group. At primary school level, a child is typically 2 to 3 years behind their peers. At secondary school, they can be between 3 and 5 years behind their peers when it comes to their emotional maturity. So this means our kids with ADHD are going to have real difficulties regulating their emotions, managing and understanding stress, so making sense of their anxiety, and also coping with change, adapting, being flexible in their thinking. We might find that they struggle a little bit more than other people in their classes do, purely because of the nature of the condition. And then I was thinking, while I was putting the slides together, about what your child's view of school is going to be, what their expectation is versus what the actual reality of school is going to be. So with that in mind, thinking about every school setting is going to be different to what the child left behind. I'm sure some of your children have already started school this week. I've been back in schools yesterday and today and Tuesday, and I have seen a significant change in the environments at schools. We've now got children sitting in rows facing forwards. There's hand sanitising units everywhere. There's signs up telling them to socially distance. So the environment has changed significantly from March. So what we, I suppose, need to be prepared for is the child's expectation of school based on what March was? So based on what their previous experience has been? Or are they aware of the reality of what school is going to be? And what we need to be really, really kind of clear on is that we support them to understand the reality and we prepare them as much as possible before they go in or in these coming weeks. There's some wonderful ways that you can do this with school. I work really closely with lots of schools in the Northwest, and I've worked with some fantastic teachers who have taken photos of the classroom environment, taken pictures of the corridors, the hall, the eating hall, canteen area, spaces common spaces within the school they've got photos of. They've created photo books, and these photo books have been sent home. It's a really, really lovely resource that you can support your child at home with. So when they come home, possibly feeling dysregulated or stressed by the changes at home, you've got picture examples of things to talk through it with them, prepare them for the next day. So when you go in, this is what school is going to look like again. What we know is for children with ADHD in particular, they really struggle to hold information in their mind. What we tend to find is they store information, and within minutes, seconds for some of our children, that information goes very quickly. If we have picture representations of things, it supports memory, and we call it working memory. It helps them to hold things in mind a lot longer. So I suppose it's asking yourselves the questions as parents. What's your child's view of school? Is it a realistic view of how school is going to look now? And ideally, the number of schools that we've worked with that have got websites and Twitter pages where they've posted videos, virtual tours of school. So asking those questions, what things have they put in place to support the transition and support our children coming back after this period away? We also know our kids are going to have loads of questions. I have been overwhelmed with questions from the children that I've worked with, and not all of the questions have been the questions that I thought they would ask. One girl last week, the most important thing to her was to find out what school was going to smell like. She had her kind of link with school was that school smelt a certain way. And what we know, the sense of smell is our strongest sense that helps us with our memory. So when it comes to things like when we smell a certain perfume or when we smell a suntan lotion that takes us back to a holiday that we've been on, our sense of smell really helps us to either ground ourselves and manage our anxieties and think back to previous memories. And she was aware of a sense of smell that school had. She was also aware smells have changed over the last few months. If you're anything like me, my flat stinks of Zoflora because I have used Zoflora to disinfect areas. The lavender one, if anybody is interested, it's a very lovely smell, but it's a very strong smell. And I know schools are using disinfectant sprays, Dettol wipes, hand sanitizer stinks going into the shops. So she was really conscious that school's not going to smell like what I thought it was going to smell like. And her question to me last week was, what's school going to smell like? And actually I was like, I don't know, because I've not been to your school, but maybe that's something we can ask school. School were amazing at responding to that. They got a little piece of fabric and they squirted the disinfectant spray on the fabric and got that sent home so that she could just have a little smell, so that she could just familiarise herself and help to feel grounded with that returning back to school. Other questions might be for our little ones, am I going to get to play with my friends at playtime? I know the schools that we're working in, and I'm sure it's exactly the same for you guys. These schools are functioning in bubbles, which means that the children have staggered playtimes and break times. So break times won't be shared with other year groups. So it might be that your child has a child in a year group that's older than them or younger than them that they've been used to playing with. It could be that they're not going to be able to do that when they go back. So preparing them for that. Other things, can I sit with my friend during learning time? I know from the pictures that I've seen in schools that the tables are in rows and children are sat a chair apart. So they're kind of next door but one to another child. So because of the social distancing in some of our schools. So that might mean that you're not going to be sitting right next to your best friend. Also, another question that a little one asked me, this is a 6-year-old that has taken quite a lot of time to settle into school. She's taken a lot of time to kind of be comfortable with the school environment. Something that was really, really important to her before lockdown was when she entered into school, she gave her teacher a big cuddle. And for her, that settled her nerves coming into school. Now, the question that she had at the age of 6 was, am I still going to be able to hug my teacher? Now, if that's something that's not going to be able to happen, we need to prepare them. So I suppose it's being prepared and ready to answer those questions. The way that we can prepare ourselves as adults is find out as much information as possible from the school of what the changes are, what the changes have been, so that we're well equipped to answer those questions. And saying to our kids, if we don't know the answer, I'm sorry, I don't know, but I'll do my best to find out for you. It's okay if we don't know the answers, because they will come up with some really obscure ones that we're not going to, and we don't know all the answers, and that's okay too. So don't put pressure on yourselves if you don't know the answers. Now, I just want to share with you This idea of stages of change. I love this because I think it really helps us to think about where our children might be positioning emotionally from the experiences that they've been through. So what happens when we experience change is that we go through different stages of emotions and experiences. At the beginning of a change, and you might have seen this with your child or children at the beginning of lockdown, what we tend to find is they experience shock to begin with. Shock is often shock that something's happened. Shock tends to take place when we don't have all the information. So when we feel like we don't really know what's going on, that's when we experience the shock at the beginning. It then moves into something we call denial. So denying that this is happening, not wanting to accept that what's going on is really going on. And that then often moves into anger and frustration by what's happening. Now, you might have seen at this stage, and you might have seen this maybe May, June time, at home, the anger might have been projected onto you as parents. I found with lots of the children that I supported during lockdown, they were really frustrated with their parents, unfortunately, and it's because you are the closest thing to them. So what I found was they were frustrated that the restrictions had been in place. They weren't allowed to go to school. They weren't allowed to see their friends and close family members anymore. They were only allowed out once a day for half an hour. And what I found was that anger was projected onto kind of close family members. Once we kind of cycle through those emotions, we then naturally move into something called realization. Realization is the moment where we realize this change is going to be around for a little while. At this point, we can often see low mood or levels of anxiety starting to kind of rear its head a little bit. Oh, sorry, guys, I've moved over there. Realization is that moment where we realize this change is going to be here for a while, and it can often be a time when we struggle a little bit. As adults, we might have experienced this as well. This then moves into optimism, and optimism is where we are quite impatient. So we've accepted that the change is happening, I've realized it, I've accepted it, but I'm impatient for when it's going to get back to a level of what feels normal. And then we then finally end with something called integration. And integration is probably where our children have been in the last few weeks or months. Integration is where I know the change has happened, I'm confident with the change, and I'm ready to take on the world. I'm ready to take on the new normal and kind of integrate into this new way of being. Now, what we need to hold in mind with every change, in particular for our children with neurodevelopmental conditions, who often struggle with flexibility of thought and managing change, they might and are likely to start at the top of the change cycle with every new change that is presented to them. So what we might find in the next few weeks and months is that they demonstrate that cycle of change again. And just being prepared for that, I suppose, and knowing that it's kind of it's a cycle that they will be going through, and that there is optimism there and there is integration, and we will get there. But some children might get to the integration stage at different levels to another child. So where one child might be able to get to integration within the first kind of 6 weeks, another child might take a little bit longer. Particularly our children with ADHD, they're likely to not get to the integration stage for a couple of months. So just kind of holding that in mind, I suppose. Also thinking about personality traits of our kids. The different personality traits are going to have a significant impact on how they cope with things. So when we think about personality traits, we think about our extroverts. So an extroverted child is often our children that are very active, very optimistic, quite impulsive. We tend to find our extroverted children are the children that like to communicate, like to tell us how they're feeling, need constant movement. And then on the other side, we've got our introverted children. And our introverted kids are the children that might be quieter, more reserved, maybe from a social perspective, prefer to be alone. We also find that these children are quite withdrawn or anxious about things, so they don't necessarily communicate to us how they're feeling. Now, what we've got to think about is we need to identify what is our child's personality trait, because we will then decide what strategies are going to suit them best. So for our extroverted children, these kids are going to need lots of opportunity for movement, lots of opportunity when they come out of school to burn off some of that excess energy. They're also going to need lots and lots of support with co-regulation. Co-regulation is us as adults supporting them to manage their emotions. So they're going to need lots of opportunities. I'm going to talk you through how we do that as the session goes on. Then on the other side, if we've got an introverted child, these children are going to need quiet spaces. These children are going to need, when they get home, a space at home to just desensitize from the day. So it could be a pop-up tent. I've worked with one teenage boy and he crawls under his bed after school because it's so overwhelming for him. He just needs to switch off to the world a little bit. So think about, is there a space at home when they come home from school? We reduce verbal interaction. We don't ask them how the day's gone. We just allow them to quietly slow down and calm down from the day. Time to reflect. And then also thinking about giving them opportunities to express how they're feeling, but doing that indirectly. So not relying on them to tell us. Sometimes we need them to show us. I'm working with one teenage girl and she has set up a journal. And every day after school, she writes in the journal. Mum has access to the journal, but they don't discuss it. Mum is able to read it later on at night, and it's the daughter's way of communicating how she's feeling. I've got a boy, he's 7, that I support. He loves technology, and he's going to email his mum and dad at the end of every day off his iPad and just let them know how his day's been and how he's feeling. Because if somebody asks him a direct question, how are you feeling? He can't manage it. He finds it really overwhelming because he's one of our quieter kids. So it's just trying, how can we set up those communication systems that are going to relieve some of those anxieties for them, but allow them to express how they're feeling. And then I wanted to show you this. I'm kind of throwing lots of things at you at the moment, but this is another thing that I like to think about. And this is thinking about where our children are sitting at the moment. So this is the idea that we cycle through different zones depending on different sets of circumstances we find ourselves in. The first zone, which is the blue zone, this is our comfort zone. Now, our comfort zone was possibly where we were back in January, where we hadn't been in lockdown. We didn't really know that this was going to happen. Lockdown kind of will have pushed us all very much so into our stretch zone. But the comfort zone basically is where we're in autopilot. Day-to-day things happen and we just kind of get on with them. But what we know is when we're in the comfort zone, actually we're not pushing ourselves that much. Very little learning takes place at this point. We don't really want our kids to be in the comfort zone when it comes to learning. What we need them to be is in the stretch zone. Now, the stretch zone is where we're being pushed out of the comfort zone enough to pique anxiety so that it creates motivation for us, but doesn't send us into a point of panic, which is the red zone. And the red zone is our stress zone. And this is the place that we don't want our children to be or ourselves to be. The red zone is where we've been pushed way past our stretch zone. We're overwhelmed with anxiety and we're not able to manage logical thinking, because what happens when we go into our stress response, our logical brain switches off. When our logical brain switches off, learning doesn't happen. So, and you'll know this as adults, when you're stressed, the amount of daft things that we do, I become very clumsy. I forget things. I can't plan and organize because my mind just feels full because I'm feeling really stressed. It's exactly the same for our children. Now, where we want them to be sitting ideally is in the stretch zone. But what we've got to be thinking about is our child in the red zone when we're thinking about them going back to school? Are they stressing or worrying that much that their anxiety is overwhelming them? And if it's overwhelming them, we've got to be really mindful that learning's not going to happen for them if that's the case. So what we've got to do is we've got to identify what zone they're in to the best of our ability. It's not easy to pinpoint these zones, but we'll have a good idea and a good sense of our children. If we feel that they're in the red zone, this is where we've got to plan really well with school and work really closely with them. Because what the next slide shows us, and I'll go back to the previous one, is that what happens when we experience anxiety, something that we're frightened of, our anxiety levels will peak. And they peak to a point where when we first exposed ourselves to it, we sometimes feel that anxiety isn't going to go away. It urges us to want to run away from things. Our fight, flight, or freeze response is activated. For some children, managing fight, flight, or freeze is really overwhelming for them. So it sends them into a bit of a panic and stress levels that are very unhealthy for them. Now, if that's the case, what we need to do is think about how we gradually expose them to what they're fearful of. Because what this chart on this slide demonstrates to us is when we are exposed to what we're fearful of over a period of time, the fear lessens, which means the anxiety lessens. So I'll give you an example of my experience of this. Going to do the food shop at the very, very beginning of lockdown sent me into an anxiety spin. I absolutely hated it. I didn't know whether I needed to wear gloves, whether I needed to take my Sephora with me. I didn't really know what was happening. Now, 6 months down the line, I'm probably within 2 months of having to do it every week because I needed food and I couldn't get delivery slots. I also wasn't a vulnerable person that needed the delivery slots either. I had to go and do it. Now, it's just, I know what I need to do. I'm less anxious about it because I've exposed myself to it over a period of time. It's exactly the same for our kids. So what we've got to identify is if the anxiety is going to be overwhelming for them, how can we slowly introduce them into school? And that's talking with school. Is there an opportunity for reduced timetables? That means, and reduced timetable is where a child might just do half a day, or might do the first couple of hours, might go in for the afternoon because the afternoon is less structured than the morning, might benefit from the structure, so needs the morning time. Or is there a way that if that can't happen, is there a key adult at school that can be there to support the child? So when if the child has to stay for the full day, is there a key adult that can work with the child so that the child goes into lessons for half an hour at a time, comes out for half an hour, does some relaxation techniques? It's trying to think about how can we build the tolerance of anxiety, build the tolerance of stress by slowly kind of introducing them to it. Other ways that we can do that as well is by having those things at home. So when I was talking to you about having photos available, asking schools to take a video of school. I've got a wonderful school up here in Liverpool, and their head teacher's done a virtual tour, and she's explained right the way through the process from the gates, the fact that the children are going to be going in different gates, different year groups are going in different gates, that they've got to wash their hands as soon as they come into school. All the different things, she's talking them through that. If you can ask your teachers or your schools to provide you with those sorts of things, then what you're able to do is then use them at home. It's just a brilliant way of that exposure without frightening and overwhelming our kids. So what we might want to do, so here's some ideas of some strategies that we might want to put in place. Now, this is a 5-point plan. I do these with so many of the kids that I work with. And a 5-point plan is basically trying to identify with your kids, where about they sit from an anxiety level and how that looks, how that feels, and what strategies they can use when they're feeling like that. So if they're at grade 1, that's your child is at a space where they feel very comfortable. So what is it in the school day that you would grade yourself a 1? You're comfortable, your anxiety levels aren't peaking, you're managing the day. We then go through the grading scale 1 to 5, and as we get close to 5, it's the things that are piquing our anxiety. 5 being something that piques my anxiety to the point where I'm in the red zone, the point where I'm really, really struggling. And here's an example one for you. So for this child, this is an example of a child that I worked with before lockdown. And for him, playing out, he was a primary school age child. Playing out was a grade 1 for him. It felt fun for him. And he didn't really need to do anything. He didn't need to try anything. He just needed to continue having a lovely time with his friends. For him, level 5, so what would cause him significant difficulty was comprehension, was his English lessons. He felt when he was in those English lessons, because they were noisy, he got quite angry and got mad. It was actually the time that we would see a lot of his behavioural kind of expressions at that point. So we would then talk about, okay, what is it that you don't like about it? And he said it was the noise, it was too loud. So what we then talked about was, well, your strategy would be, let's get some headphones, let's put the headphones in, or ask an adult for help. Or let's talk about, is there a key person in your classroom that can support you at that point? So it's just trying to work out with your children whereabouts they sit, what things they can grade, and then being solution focused. Okay, if you're feeling a 3, this is what you can do to manage that. And trying to think of some strategies with them. I love these because it's a really proactive thing that parents can do at home, and the children can take it in. Something that you've thought about and the teachers haven't had to. It's also great, the teachers love them as well. It's also a really lovely resource that you can recommend for the teachers too. So I work with lots of teachers who love these themselves. So if you're able to collaborate with the teachers, that's brilliant. Something else that you might want to try, lots of the children that I'm working with are feeling quite out of control at the moment. In particular, our children with ADHD and on the autistic spectrum, who really need that sense of control and to know what's happening, struggling to be flexible with the change. This is an activity that you can do with them. So you get a piece of paper and you draw a circle in the middle and you write down all of the things that are within their control at the moment. So that might be things in the morning before they go to school that they have control of. That could be themselves getting dressed, what they have for their breakfast, how they pack their bags. Then the things in school that they are within their control. So how often they sanitize their hands. I've got loads and loads of children that are really, really anxious about talking about COVID-19. Just even the words are creating an anxious response for them. So in the I can control bit, how much I talk about it, who I sit next to. The out of control bits are the things that are not within my control, go outside of the circle. So that might be what happened, how often my friend next to me is hand sanitizing. That's not within my control. When I can go and have my play in my break times, at the moment, that's not within my control. And what we talk about is, let's focus on the things that we can control. Because the things that we can't control, we need to try and let those go. And it helps us to feel grounded. It helps us to kind of understand what we're able to manage. It helps us to kind of put our routines in place as well. It helps us to feel clear and really concise about things when we know that we have certain levels of control over things. Other things that are going to be really important are daily routines, help manage anxiety, particularly thinking about our children with ADHD. We know kids with ADHD really struggle with some of those frontal lobe skills. Frontal lobe skills are things like planning, organising, remembering things. When we are able to visualise these things for them, we call it externalise what's not happening internally. So if they're struggling to plan what the day is going to look like, if they're struggling to plan getting ready in the morning, brushing their teeth, getting showered, if we can use pictures and have a visual representation of that, it really helps them to make sense and supports that planning. What we know is children with neurodevelopmental conditions often have a 15-second delay when it comes to verbal processing. So it can take them 15 seconds to make sense of a question or make sense of an instruction. And that can cause us difficulties in the morning when we're in a little bit of a rush. When we can focus using pictures, we're taking away that processing time. We're reducing the stress on the brain. And if our children are already feeling stressed, we've got to try and calm the brain by reducing the amount of instructions that we're giving. Pictures really help us to do that. Timers are also really great. I work with lots of children. We are motivated by time as humans. When I was doing qualifications, when I had my dissertation in for my degree, I was given 6 months to write my dissertation. I wrote it in the last week. And I wrote it in the last week because I knew I only had 7 days to complete it. It motivated me to get cracking. Timers do that for our kids with ADHD. So if we can time them, we can show them how long they've got left before they leave the house, or maybe how long they've got left before they need to move on from eating their breakfast to brushing their teeth. It motivates them to get going. It's a little bit of a competition. Our kids with ADHD love to be competitive, love competition. It also helps to structure the routine. It helps them to feel safe and scaffolded by the fact that I know that something's coming to an end and something's going to change. I also work with lots of families that use music to support those transitions as well. I've got one mum of an 8-year-old boy and they use Spotify. He's got a favourite song. It's a Bruno Mars song. And every time there's a transition, particularly in the morning, mum says to him, I'm going to put Bruno Mars on. When this song has finished, I want you to be fully dressed and to have your teeth brushed. And while they're doing it, they have a dance and he absolutely loves it. And he's also in that kind of motivated mode of, it's coming to an end, I've got to brush my teeth. But it structures that daily routine for them. It's also positive and it's a happy way of doing it too. Another thing that we might want to try, we talk about the when and then strategies quite a lot with our families. And it's when and then, again, reduces verbal processing time. It's very much where we say to a child, when you've done this, then this will happen. What I tend to find in my work is the children are great at bartering with us. So they might say, well, what if I do that first? Then I'll do that. And then I'll do what you've asked me. after that. No, if we are very clear and very concise, when you've done this, sorry guys, then this will happen. It's very clear, it's very concise. We're not overcomplicating it with more words. We're just telling them when and then. And we also need to think sensory for our children. When we are more stressed, and that's all people, that's not just people with ADHD, we often have heightened responses to our senses, in particular sensitivity to noise. So reducing kind of voice volume is going to be really important. What we tend to find is when we're stressed, and you might have experienced this as adults, probably over lockdown, which has been a really stressful time, we very much become more aware of our environments and what's happening around us. So think sensory when we think about our children. Some sensory things that are really, really useful are some heavy work activities, we call them. It's grounding in the now. So lovely ways that you can do this. And I work with some wonderful families that have been really creative with this as well. So heavy work is basically pressure on the body. I say it's like the way when you're feeling stressed and somebody gives you a hug. For some of us, that relieves our anxieties, that makes us feel better. Or for others of us, it's the worst thing that somebody can do. But for our children that need that, it might be that a hug doesn't do it for them, but we could maybe look at some exercises that will do that for them. Something that I loved, one of the mums that I supported, I've supported for a long time, she has a pair of oven gloves. She puts rice in the hands of the oven gloves and stitches it up. And then the oven gloves act as a lap belt, a weighted lap belt. So really cheap, which we love, because I know that some of the equipment can be really, really expensive. When her child comes home from school, because her child gets quite overwhelmed during the school day, this is a child who, during the school day, masks, does a really, really good job throughout the day, but gets home and kind of explodes as soon as they get home. So when this child gets home, mum offers the lap belt, and the child will sit with the lap belt on across her knees. It really helps to ground this little one. Another child that I've worked with, I recommended it off the back of this mum, and they use it as a shoulder weight. So as long as they're responsible with it and you know that they can be safe with it, using the same kind of idea, the oven gloves, but on shoulders to weigh the shoulders down. Other things that you can use, I worked with one mum and she's bought a door wedge in the shape of a fox. She bought it from Home and Bargain or B&M or anywhere like that, and that sits on the child's knee while they're having their tea. It was a particularly stressful time for their child, so they sit with that on their knee. For our teenagers, I've got a year 7 boy. He loves a heavy backpack. He has packed every single book for every single lesson possible, and he puts it in his backpack. And what he said to me was, when he's got his backpack on, because it's pushing down on his shoulders, it really helps him to feel grounded and safe. Another child I work with his mum buys clothes a couple of sizes too small. She makes sure that they're like elasticated. So things like the Under Armour stuff that our children can wear when they go and play football, or if that like gym wear that's kind of a little bit elasticated, buy some of them a couple of sizes smaller. Because they're a little bit small, they're going to be squeezing, and that sense of kind of tightness of the clothes can be enough to make them feel grounded. That can be a really, really lovely way when they're in school just to feel like they're getting a cuddle, or feel like they're getting that kind of sense of touch. And yeah, I know from kind of children's reports of it, it really can help. So thinking about that and how we can support our children with that. Something else that's going to be really important, and any of my therapeutic work with any children that are struggling with anxiety, the first thing I do with them is I support them to understand anxiety. I think it's really, really important. I like to support them to understand that anxiety and stress is normal. It's a response that we all have. It's in us. We're built that way. I explain to them that stress is a response when we're feeling worried or tense or afraid of things. It's natural. Every human being has a stress response when they feel worried or frightened of something. I then explain to them that it's primitive. Lots of the kids that I work with love this idea that when we were back in the caves, we needed a stress response to keep us safe, because when there was dinosaurs or saber-toothed tigers or all the scary things that were outside of the cave, we needed something called our fight, flight or freeze response to keep us safe. which basically means we needed to either fight the dinosaurs, run away from them as quick as we can, or camouflage and freeze from them. And I explained that we still have that in us because we are the same species as we were back in the caves. But what triggers our stress response these days can be very, very different things. And I'll talk to them, what things do you think trigger your stress response? And they'll say things like walking into a busy classroom. For some children, it can be having to talk to somebody and tell them how I'm feeling. And then explain to them that there's hormones that happen when we have our fight, flight or freeze response, that these are called adrenaline and cortisol. And when we are flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, our body is preparing to either fight, run away or freeze. So that means parts of our body become stronger. And then I move on to this activity with them. So I then, once we've had that discussion, I then draw around their bodies, or if they're older, I get them to draw an outline of their body or a picture of themselves, but it needs to be full body picture. And I ask them questions like, when you get angry, where in your body do you feel it? When you're worried, how does your body react? And I've had a range of different responses. I've had children say things to me like, my head feels like it's going to explode. My heart feels like it's going to pump out of my chest. I've had a number of children that say it feels like it comes out of my hands, and they'll explain that that's why they damage things or why they hurt themselves or hurt other people. Other children will say it comes out my feet. I need to run and kind of stomp it off, or I kick things. And what we're doing is we're trying to work out from a physical perspective where you feel your fight, flight or freeze response. When we can establish that, then we can put support in place and strategies to meet that need. I also explain to them that when we have that fight, flight or freeze, the areas of our body that we need for those three things, they're the bits that become stronger. The areas that we don't need weaken, which is our digestive system and often the brain. And when the brain weakens, logical thought weakens, which is why we don't always make sense of what people are saying when we're anxious or worried. It's also why when we're stressed, we feel sick. Children will tell you their anxieties through their physical responses. So you will have had children, and I'm sure, that have said things, and they might have done it today going into school. I don't want to go, I feel sick. Or I'm not very well, I've got a headache. They are responding by telling us what their fight, flight or freeze reaction is. And we just need to reassure them of that that's part of feeling frightened of something. So then once we've established it, we then look at some strategies, and I'll talk about that with you now. So for some of our children, this is great for our Key Stage 2 children in particular. So this is an idea of we challenge their thinking. So whatever it is that they are anxious or worried about, we ask them to tell us if they're able to. If they're not able to tell us, draw it for me, write it down, email me, which I love that lots of our kids are using technology better than we are at the moment. And then we challenge it. Okay, so that's what you're worrying about. Where's your evidence that that's going to happen? So if you were to stand up in a court of law in front of a judge, would he believe you as to what you're thinking? It's a really lovely way of helping them to try and reframe their thinking. Another lovely one that you might want to use, I love this as a check-in. Great for when your children are leaving in the morning and for when they come home. We call them scaling questions. I scale questions all the time in my therapeutic work. It's basically you have a scale of 0 to 10, and you might want to make a scale with your children. I worked with some children that have come up with some really lovely ones, lovely designs. And it's the idea that as an adult, we ask the child on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the worst thing in the whole wide world, 0 being the best outcome, how are you feeling right now? So it might be, how are you feeling about going into school? How do you feel now that school has finished? And the child will respond with a number. And if the child says, I'm feeling 5, you then say to them, okay, so you're feeling 5, what would it take to get you to a 3? Or if your child says, I'm feeling 10, I'm feeling 10, I'm feeling 10, we then say to them, okay, I can see that you're feeling 10. What do we need to do to get you to a 7? Now, what we've got to be really careful of is we don't have too big a gap. So if a child tells us they're feeling 10 and we ask them how we get them to a 1, that's a really big step that they've got to make. So we just maybe say, okay, you're feeling 10, how can we get you to a 9? For some of our kids, it's just a really lovely way of them trying to think about where they're sitting on that scaling line. And also then it's an opportunity for us to problem solve with them. Okay, let's be realistic about where we can get to and how we can get there. Something else, these have been something that I've spoken to all of the secondary schools that I've done work with on the preparation of getting back into school. These are transition passports. A transition passport, you could do this at home with your kids. And this is basically a passport that goes with the child. It's particularly important for our children in secondary school, because my understanding is that the children are going to be staying in the same class all day, and it's the adults that are going to be moving around. Which is going to be particularly difficult for our kids with ADHD who need lots of movement. That movement is going to be taken away from them, I'm imagining. Now, a transition passport basically houses all the information that any adult that comes into contact with your child, all the information is there for them. So there might be an all about me. So an all about me is details of the things that your child enjoys, the things that your child might find difficult, what the adult could do to help them. You might also want to put a 5-point plan in there. So this is something, as a family, we've discussed with our child. This is what they're telling us they're going to be struggling with. And this is the solution that our child has come up with as well. You might want to put in there maybe some of the resources that they need. Some kids that I work with have a sensory box. Sensory box helps them, or a calm down box, or a calm down space. If an adult knows that they've got access to that, then that's in the transition passport. They're prepared for that work with the child as well. We also might want to house in the transition passport things that are going to remind the child of home. You know, they've been at home with you for a very long time, longer than we ever anticipated would happen. So for lots of kids, that attachment to family is going to be really, really strong. Also, leaving those children, leaving our kids, leaving our families is going to increase anxiety, in particular because we've had such an intense time. So a transition passport can house things that remind children of home. So pictures of you, pictures of the house, pictures of all the lovely things that maybe you did during lockdown. You might have some photos on your phones of particularly lovely moments during lockdown. I've got one child that has taken handprints of all of her family, and she's put them in a photo album. So she's got a piece of paper, they've all painted the hands, and they've all done a handprint, and then that member of the family has written their name next to it. She's going to take that in her blazer pocket. And for her, we call it object permanence. Object permanence is, if I can't see it, how do I know it exists anymore? For our kids with ADHD and autism in particular, they can often really struggle with object permanence, which is usually why our kids with ADHD and autism struggle to settle at night time when we leave the bedroom, because the minute they can't see you, they don't know that you're there anymore, which is often why they're standing at the top of the stairs shouting for us, or they come down every 5 minutes to check that we're still there. If we can visually show them where we are, it helps to support object permanence. We also know, and research has told us this, that when we can hold on to something physically, it makes it concrete. So it also might be that there's something at home that will help to support them, an object that they can bring in. I've got one boy and he's got his mum's perfume. It's not one that she uses, thank goodness, because she'd be out of perfume, I think, every day, but he takes the smell of the perfume on a piece of fabric and he keeps it in his pocket. So when he's struggling in school, he just has a little smell of the perfume and he feels that connectedness to mum again. Really, really important for some of our kids. Something else that we might want to try. I'm really conscious I'm throwing lots of information at you today. And please take the bits that are useful for you. You know, not all of it will be helpful for you and your child, but hopefully you'll pick up on bits that will be. This is a great resource. I use this a lot. These are called our blob people. Now you can get these pictures off Google. There's a website at the bottom there. If you just type in blob tree, it'll come up in Google. And basically, this is a resource that you use. I print these off and laminate them in my therapeutic work. You basically say to a child, which blob represents you at the moment? So they will either tell us if they're confident to do that, or they'll colour in the blob person, or they'll draw a circle around it or a big arrow that points to whichever blob represents them. What's lovely is they're showing us how they're feeling. It doesn't need a conversation after it if the child's not comfortable with that, but it's a way of them indirectly expressing their emotions. What's really interesting is children's blobs will change in the course of 5 minutes. So I've worked with some children that will point out one blob at the very beginning of a session, and then it's a totally different blob a couple of minutes later. Hopefully it's a more positive blob because they're feeling more settled. But again, a lovely way to indirectly discuss emotions. We also might want to think about how we prepare our children for understanding the social constructs of what school's going to be like. So social constructs are things like understanding what social distancing means, understanding what we do when we go to wash our hands, how we wash our hands, how we sanitize our hands. The way that we can do that, we can do it through the use of social stories or comic strip conversations. A comic strip conversation in particular is a series of comic strip pictures. So you can draw them yourself, the child can draw them. And those pictures are basically social instructions. So the first picture might be a picture of the child walking into the toilet area. The second picture might be the child standing at the sink. The third picture, a picture of the child washing their hands. With soap, making sure that you've got that picture of the soap there. And then the fourth picture might be using paper towels. Fifth picture, the paper towels going in the bin. It's basically a visual representation of the social constructs of things. Again, helps to get it out of the brain, helps to get it on paper. It's easier for me to make sense of. We also might want to think about, for our children that are talking about their hearts racing or their minds feeling full, introducing them to some relaxation techniques. Mindfulness really helps kids with ADHD in particular. The one on the left-hand side is one of my favourites. It's Calm Down with Take 5. All of these you can get on the internet. Just type into YouTube, breathing techniques for children and young people. The one on the left is hand breathing, finger at the base of the thumb. You breathe in, you hold, and then you breathe out. And you literally just trace around the finger, breathing in and breathing out. I teach this to most of the children that I work with because your hand is always going to be there. I also work with little ones, and we do something called square breathing, which is the one on the top right. And that's where you picture a square, and you can find a square anywhere. It doesn't need to be a square that's related to the picture there. You know, a window could be enough. Find a square in the room and follow the outline of that square. As you go across, breathe in, hold, breathe out, hold, breathe in. And it's just a way of helping them to think about breathing and slowing down. This on the right hand side, this is a mindfulness jar. I love these. You get an old jar, could be a Dolmio, anything. Clean it out, take the sticker off the front of it. You fill it with lukewarm water and glitter glue. Put the lid back on, shake it up, and then you talk to your child about what's happening to the glitter now that I've shook it up, and the glitter goes wild. And we say, when we're feeling stressed or worried, that's what's happening inside our bodies. We then put the mindfulness jar down on the table, and we say to our children, when we breathe and when we stop and when we think about things, what's happening to the glitter now? And naturally, the glitter settles to the bottom of the jar. And we explain to our children that when we take time to stop and breathe and relax, our emotions settle just like the glitter does. Again, it's lovely because they can hold on to it. They can take it into school if they're allowed to. They can bring it home if they're allowed to. Something else that's really lovely, I've got one child that uses a feather. And she uses it in lots of different ways. She uses it, she puts it in front of her face, and she blows on it. And it's, how long can you keep the feather down for? It's breathing, it's slowing the breath down. Also, holding on to it, she doesn't realise that it's actually a breathing technique. It's a game for her. She also uses it to brush up and down her arm because that helps to relax her. So some of those might be really useful. These are some apps that can be really helpful as well. The top line are some apps that you can get for younger children. The bottom line are the apps for our older children. And the ones at the bottom, Mood Gym in particular, is great for our teenagers because it's like a journal. They monitor their moods as the time goes on. So you might want to have a little look at that. I love Stop, Breathe and Think Kids. I've got it on my iPad, and I use that with all of my primary school age kids. There's also Stop, Breathe and Think, which is probably more appropriate for our Key Stage 2 kids. So that's our children in kind of year 3 to year 6, and maybe some of our year 7s as well. Something else that we might want to try, I'm really conscious that I'm running out of time. This is where more challenging of thinking. I love this one, and I actually use it myself. So it's the idea that there are 3 people and the same set of circumstances happening to all 3 people, but the way that each person responds is very different. So in this example, the circumstances are that the bus is late. They're all standing at a bus stop and the bus doesn't turn up. Person 1 is the worrier. That's the person who's thinking, oh no, I'm going to lose my job. They're feeling anxious, worried and stressed, and their behaviour changes. So they become sweaty, they're panicking, they're texting the boss. Person 2 is our angry person. So this is the person that's at these buses are always late, I'm fuming. They get angry, they get frustrated. Their behaviour, they huff and puff, they're stomping around. The consequence is the bus is still going to be late. Person 3, which is the person that I'm sure we'd all love to be, person 3 is the person that's thinking, there's nothing I can do about this. They feel calm, their behaviour is relaxed, the consequence is still the same. And basically what we do is we talk to children about which person are you? And 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you person 1 or person 2. Okay, what do you need to do to be person 3? I work with some children that'll say to me, Emma, I've been person 2. I'm feeling person 2. And I'll go, okay, so you're feeling really angry at the moment. And they'll say, yeah. And I'll go, okay, what do we need to do to be person 3? It's just a really way of them evaluating, I suppose, some of their thoughts and some of their feelings. Another one, sorry, more things being thrown at you. This is another lovely one. This is from a website called the ELSA website, Emotional Literacy Support Assistance website, where they've got lots of free resources. This is where we identify a negative thought and we challenge the negative thought. So we get a child to write down what's the negative thought, write it down in the circle at the bottom left. You can adapt this so that it's more appropriate for an older child as well. Maybe the ant isn't kind of cool when you're 16. So, make your own. And then you just ask them questions. Is this thought helpful? Is there another way of looking at this thought? What's your evidence that the thought's going to come true? If one of your best friends told you the thought, would you believe them? What advice would you give them? And then you reframe it. So come up with a more realistic, optimistic way of thinking about that. So let's think about all of those questions. How can we reframe it so it feels more positive for us? Getting it down on paper, again, great for our kids with ADHD because it's concrete. It's on paper and I can see it. We also use the stop, think and do strategy. I love this one. This is kind of like a bit like a mantra. It's the idea that we say to our children and we think about it and we coach it consistently. We need to stop, we need to think, and then we need to complete the action. So we need to stop, we need to think, and thinking might be doing some of those challenging our thoughts activities. The thinking stage might be, I need to breathe, I need to get my mindfulness jar and watch the glitter calm down, and then I need to decide what I'm going to do. Great for our children who are impulsive. In my therapeutic work, I make these stop, think and do kind of prompts, picture prompts. The children make them themselves, they decorate them, they make them look gorgeous. We laminate them, we then put them on a keychain and they hook them onto their pants or inside their blazer. Visual prompt for when I'm getting this surge of kind of physical experience of my anxiety. There's my visual prompt. I need to stop, I need to think, and then I need to do. Be really, really useful. For our children that are telling us that they're feeling really physical, that they've got those big feelings in their hands or in their feet, loads and loads of sensory stuff will be great. Setting up sensory stuff for when they come home. Resistance bands have been my best friend since my work at the ADHD Foundation. A resistance band, you can get them in all sorts of sports shops. It's just a band that you pull, you can squeeze, you can put your feet around it and stretch your legs. Really great for those, getting rid of the fuzzy feelings I talk about with our little ones, getting rid of that kind of need to grab something or kind of kick something and things like that. If resistance bands, if you can't get hold of them, a pair of tights does exactly the same job. I've been informed by one of the mums that I support. Also, yoga balls can be really great. I work with one mum, and when her child comes home from school, he lies on his tummy and she just rolls the yoga ball over the top of him. These are some other things that can be really useful. When I talked about that heavy work stuff, getting your child to push against walls, sitting on chairs and pushing down against the chairs. That's the human sock, which is on the top right. That's something that you can buy. It's something that the kids climb into, and they great for our younger ones. They stretch out and they pull and really gets rid of some of those fuzzy feelings. Trampolines, brilliant. Loads and loads of opportunity just to get rid of some of that kind of energy that they've got towards the end of the day. Helps them to kind of regulate again and manage some of those big feelings. And this is another kind of thing that might be useful. We call it the problem solver. This is a great reflection tool. The problem solver is basically when a situation's happened, we sit down with the child and we ask them to write down, tell me what happened. On the left-hand side, what did you do within that situation and what was the consequence of that behaviour? So an example of a family that I worked with, younger sibling came into the bedroom, younger sibling pinched the PlayStation controller off the older child unfortunately punched the younger child in frustration. The consequence was the PlayStation was taken off him for a week. For him, really frustrated by that. We then talk about it in a really non-judgmental way. What could you have done differently? So on reflection of that, because actually it's not turned out great for you, has it? What could you do differently? And then we talk about maybe we needed to stop, think and breathe. Stop, think and do. Maybe we needed to ask an adult to help us. Maybe we need to get up and walk away. And then what would the consequence of that be? And usually it's, well, I wouldn't have had my PlayStation taken off me, would I? And then we talk about, we attach an emotion to it. So how would that make you feel? Well, I'd be happy because I'd have my PlayStation again. So always attach an emotion to it on both sides. And I think we're there. I hope that was helpful for you. And I think I've finished, just with enough time for questions. So please ask away.
Wonderful, Emma. That has been really interesting. You have really galloped through a lot of information. And we also, I should mention, I did put it in the chat box, we will also be posting the slides on our website because there are a lot of really useful resources. Are there any questions from anybody participating? If you want to type your questions in the chat box. I think I may kick off with a question. I think what I really enjoyed about your talk, Emma, was really just, looking at ways in which we can support our children, particularly when they're coming home from school and they're totally overwhelmed and so on. And sort of that empathy, I think as a parent, that's one of your jobs, is to be a detective and, to sort of figure out, what is happening. Just looking at the school, I think, I so often hear parents saying that teachers have got a lot on their plates at the moment. And a lot of teachers wouldn't necessarily be that receptive to, sort of focusing on what is really, what are the needs of each of the individual child or children in the class, just because they've got so much on their plate. What would you recommend to parents? How best do they sort of facilitate the discussion with the teacher?
That's a really good question. And I work very closely with lots of teachers. I think it's taking a very kind of proactive, positive approach to it. I think at the moment in particular, and I've been in schools in the last couple of days, the teachers are kind of very, very apprehensive, very, very nervous about the return to school themselves. I think if they kind of, if you're able to approach the teacher by maybe setting up an opportunity to talk to them via Zoom, asking them because I think approaching school at the moment, we're not able to kind of stand at the door and be face to face with our teachers, children's teachers at the moment. So asking them, what's the best mode of contact with them? Can they send regular emails? Could you set up a Zoom meeting for them? Trying to kind of offer them solutions, I suppose, showing that you are willing to adapt so that you can have those conversations with the teachers, but that you're understanding of kind of the nature of their job and the stress that they're under at the moment. But for you, it's really important that it's got right for your child. In particular, if your child is anxious about things, it's really, really important that the teacher understands that. Something that we stress so much at the ADHD Foundation is the importance of the teacher-parent relationship, and how actually if we are coming at it from a supportive perspective, then it's much better to kind of work collaboratively with the teachers. Although I know that this can be a challenge at times. So I think for me, it would be asking teachers, what's the best way that I can communicate with you? How can I make sure that we've got constant communication, but it's in a way that is going to be great, it's going to suit us both, and being kind of, I suppose, positive and solution focused around that as well.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We've got some questions from the floor. So Michelle has said she's got an 8-year-old, and they will often make up stories of terrible things that happened at school. And it's very difficult to get to the heart of the issue. How would you recommend she approaches this?
That's a really tricky one. I think we get a lot of, we call it kind of magical thinking or catastrophic thinking. I suppose it's trying to understand the root cause of the thoughts that your child has. So what is it that, why are they creating the kinds of stories around maybe things that haven't happened at school? Or what's your child's interpretation of what's happening at school? For some children with neurodevelopmental conditions in particular, the way that they interpret their environments or social situations can often be very different to what's actually happening at times. I work with lots of kids that struggle with this. So what I ask them to do and I like to do lots of timeline work. So a timeline work is where you sit down with the child and you say to them, okay, so at the beginning of this event, tell me where you were, who were you with, what was happening. And then you ask them to plot it on a bit of a timeline. So how long did it last? 10 minutes. Okay, in that 10 minutes, tell me each step of what happened. When we do that with children, what we find is if it's something that they're creating, they can't keep it up. So they kind of, because we're really focusing on it with them, they can't keep up with it. So we start to see that kind of maybe some of those kind of creative stories coming out a little bit more. And then we challenge them. So saying to a child, okay, I don't think that happened, and this is why I don't think that happened. What do you think? So we don't challenge them in a threatening way, but we just say to them, okay, I don't think that's the case. Why do you think I might not think that that's the case? And the child might respond with, oh, you never believe me, blah, 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 blah. But if we give them our perspective on things, it helps them to maybe rethink the story on it. What we know, for some children, they have difficulty with theory of mind. Theory of mind is the ability to see things from other people's perspectives. Seeing something from somebody else's perspective is like understanding somebody else's opinion is going to be different to mine as well. Also understanding that somebody's view of something is going to be very different. If we coach our children to understand our view by telling them, so I don't think that happened, this is what I think happened, we're supporting that theory of mind. They're not having to think about what we're thinking because we are physically telling them. So that might be something that you want to try. Timeline it, get them to describe it to you point by point, and if at points you don't think those things happen, in a non-confrontational way, just point that out and then tell them why. It's a great way of just coaching them to understand that.
Great, thank you. That's really, really helpful. Lynn mentioned, she has said, I'm anticipating school refusal. Any tips on how to get past this in the mornings?
School refusal, I think we're going to see a lot of this. I think not just our children with ADHD and neurodevelopmental conditions, I think lots of children. We've gone through a really tricky time, haven't we, over the last few months? I think we're all feeling really anxious at the moment. I think it's all in the preparation, I feel. For me, and I'll give you an example. I went to a secondary school yesterday to do some training, and I knew that there was going to be 90 of them, and it was face-to-face training. They'd been put in bubbles, but I was going to be in front of 90 people, 45 in one, 45 in another, and I was really, really nervous about it. Everything I've done has been working from home since March. One of the things that really reassured me was the minute I saw their risk assessment and the minute I knew the things that they'd put in place to keep me safe, the things that they'd put in place to keep their team safe. It was really thorough, it was really good. And instantly I felt relieved by that. So I was relieved by the preparation that had gone into it. So what we need to be anticipating, if we're thinking they're going to be refusing school, we need to prepare them as much as possible. And that's where we need to work really closely with the school. That's where things like the videos, the virtual tours of school, pictures of the class teacher, pictures of what the classroom's going to look like. I've worked with some fantastic schools that have done Zoom calls, teacher to child at home. So it's been creating that connectedness with the teacher as well, because that strengthening that relationship is going to be really, really important. So lots of opportunity for the child to explore that. I'm working with one teacher and she's made a pen pal with this little boy in her class. I've worked with a teenager as well who is a pen pal with their teacher as well. So it works for our older children too. So it's just thinking about how can we prepare the child as much as possible. Get your child to ask questions. What are they worried about? And let's see if we can find the answers for them as well. Because it could be that the root cause of their refusal is based on anxiety and fear of the unknown. So let's try and put as much known to it that is within our power, I suppose.
Any other questions?
I think there's one there actually, Annette, from somebody's asked about a teenage son that's been recently diagnosed.
Yes, and about extra time. I don't know if you've got any general tips. I have suggested to Sarah that we've got a great resource here in Richmond and Kingston, an organisation called kids.org, and there they've got an education liaison officer, Jonathan Rourke, to Sarah that she talks to Jonathan because he can guide her through the process. But if you've got a general tip that you want to give that will be, that's not specific to any particular council or borough that people are in, is there any comment you want to add on that?
I think I probably would have said what's the local support within your area, and that's great that you've got that. Also, the diagnosis is going to really help, because we now know that it's something that your child, the condition that your child has, which means that retaining information is going to need more time. So kind of approaching the SENCO at school. So the SENCO is the allocated person that has a specific role supporting children with special educational needs. It's the SENCO's job at school to get all of those things in place for the child as well. So the diagnostic letter will be really helpful to take into school and show them and speak to the SENCO about that.
Good, thank you. Right, I think we probably seem that we don't have any more questions from the floor. I think with that, I will draw our evening to a close. It was absolutely tremendous. And thank you so much to Emma for giving us this tremendous talk. And thanks to everybody who joined us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care.